Hello, my name is Gwen Bridge, and I'm an Indigenous advisor to Yellowstone Yukon Conservation Initiative. We're doing this talk to support their series on ethical space, a webinar series designed to develop and generate dialogue around how to move through reconciliation to advance Indigenous relations. This presentation is called Ethical Space, a framework for understanding Indigenous authority and reconciliation. When we explore our motivation for wanting better relationships between ourselves and Indigenous people, or between ourselves and non-Indigenous people, we are really looking as to why. Why do we want to achieve those things? I think there's three main reasons. The firstly is that we really have a moral imperative to resolve conflicts that perpetuate inequality within our society, to make our society more equal, more just, more enjoyable and fair for everyone in it. We also have legal imperatives to ensure that we're meeting our obligations within Canada and British Columbia to achieve the articles set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act in BC, passed in 2019. We also have an ecological imperative. We know that the world's resources, the world's biodiversity and water, air, temperature, all of those kinds of things are changing because of climate change. We understand that the Indigenous peoples are managing their land better. At the recent International Union for the Conservation of Nature in Marseille in 2021, the nation states, NGOs, and others agreed that Indigenous conservation was key to the sustainability and the future survival of our Earth. For example, 80% of the world's biodiversity is maintained within Indigenous-controlled territories or Indigenous managed territories. So we have this need to look to Indigenous people to show and to guide the conservation that's necessary. When we're thinking about how we need to proceed forward to meet these imperatives, we really have some foundational concepts which we need to know. One of them is ethical space, and I'll talk about that framework in a moment here, but we also need to understand this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. We need to understand what is reconciliation and how do we get there? What are some pragmatic steps we need to be really cognizant about when we're thinking through reconciliation? We also need to understand what's contained, what's the structural characteristics of the societies which are in opposition right now. And we need to develop an open-mindedness to develop a deep understanding of those challenges that are present by these structural and societal differences and worldviews. When we understand these things, we begin to be able to practice open-mindedness and creativity, which allow us to envision the future together that needs to be created in order for us to have a just and sustainable society. And then we can also apply that within our individual constructs as ecological and environmental managers to make sure that we're doing the right things by the earth. So I want briefly to talk about UNDRIP. UNDRIP is an Indigenous developed document signed by most of the world's nation states, which obligates them to acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights, protect those rights, and to pay to protect, redress, or mitigate impacts to those rights. So when we think about the whole entirety of UNDRIP, really these are the essence of the obligations. So as Indigenous people, we're looking to figure out how we begin to articulate those things and make sure that the states are living up to those obligations. There's a couple articles I'd like to draw your attention to. Article 27 talks a lot about the need to recognize Indigenous people's laws. When we're thinking about ethical space, when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledge, when we're thinking about science, we're really thinking about and beginning to know Indigenous law. This is really important when we're thinking about how we begin to understand some of the roots of conflict that pervade our society. Another important article is Article 31.1. It talks about manifestation of science, and I want to draw your attention to some of the high-level differentiations between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, which I'll talk about later. But Indigenous knowledge is holistic. It includes relationships, it includes societal structures, it includes law, and it includes earth-based observation. Non-Indigenous science includes earth-based observations. So there's a lot of parallels, but my point here is that when we're thinking about science, we need to make sure that we're thinking about a much more holistic and comprehensive set of guidances for society. Reconciliation is a really important concept. Reconciliation has no one consistent definition, but it guides a lot of the work that we're doing in Canada to achieve those imperatives I mentioned earlier. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has 94 calls to action, none of which explicitly relate to land management. So my question was, well, why is this? When UNDRIP has many, many articles related to land management, this is because all of those 94 calls to action are predicated on this foundational call to action, if you will, this foundational premise. In order to reconcile, the first relationship that must heal is the relationship of Indigenous people to their land. This is really important when we think about the work that we're doing towards reconciliation. Oftentimes people want to reconcile, they want to engage, and they move forward without understanding that really, if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to be believed, the relationship that we need to support, we need to serve, is related to the relationship, healing that relationship between Indigenous peoples and their land. So when we sort of think about our obligations as reconcilers, if you will, or practitioners towards reconciliation, that's a really important concept. Currently, there's no one definition of reconciliation. So what does it mean? Many people have been attempting to describe what this might mean. Some people talk about two-eyed seeing, some talk about two ways of knowing, some talk about standing on two legs. What I really like is the two-eyed seeing. We need to understand what's in these spaces within each of the eyes so that we begin to come together into that ethical space. The two-eyed seeing provides a nice metaphor because what happens when you're integrating into your brain from each eye? You're integrating within the brain a process where you're using creativity and you're synergizing and you're coming to some kind of resolution so that you can have consistency in your vision. That's really important, and this metaphor is like, well, what is in each of those eyes? And so you see here this presentation from Reg Croce, which is called Voices of Understanding, published by the Alberta Energy Regulator. Reg described this so well that this ethical space is neither an incorporation, neither an inclusion, neither integration between the two eyes, but really creating this space, this shared vision within the middle, drawing upon what's needed and what's important from each of those spheres. So what I want to talk a little bit is now, well, what is in that eye? What is in that sphere? What is in that system that we need to bring forward into ethical space so that we can build relationships based on deep understanding and grounded in cultural safety? What we need to do is understand what's in the Western side. What's in there is things like politicians, science, religion, sets of values, patriarchy, the age of enlightenment, reductionism, democratic governance, constitutions, and many other things. What's on the Indigenous side, however, is different and less well understood by all parties. TEK, traditional knowledge, stories, protocols, chiefs, different sets of values, Indigenous governance, spirituality, and community. Those things are all important to draw into this space. My argument is that Indigenous people have a very good understanding of what's contained within the Western system because it's been imposed upon them for so long through things like the Indian Act, through residential schools, this kind of thing. What's less well known by non-Indigenous people are what's in those Indigenous systems. So I'll begin to explain that briefly here. So when we're talking about what we're bringing into the system, I was working with one of my colleagues, Rob Edward, to really begin to think about, well, what do we need to understand within this space so that we can have this resolution, so we can have a reduction of conflict, so we can more deeply understand each other. We came up with a framework which is called the dual authoritative hierarchical framework, which is centered around ethical space. So it's really what we need to bring from a societal and systemic structural perspective into the space, and centered around the legislative frameworks for each society. When I describe this framework, I really want to have people begin to think about where authority for how we behave comes from. Who makes the laws? This is really the fundamental difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous society in many Indigenous societies. I'm not suggesting this is a pan-Indigenous framework. This is based on who I am, my experiences, my thought processes. So that's a caveat. But on the Western side, we have the authority for how human societies dictate behavior to its participants. Where does that authority, why do we do the things we do? Where does it come from? And so we began to think about this. And so we thought, well, the ultimate authority in any society, at least in most Indigenous societies and Western society, comes from the God or the Creator, from this metaphysical, right? And so on the Western side, we have the Creator or God giving authority for how humans will behave to a human entity. So the human entity interprets God's will and says, okay, well, we're going to behave in this certain way. We're going to make the decisions about how relationships on Earth are manifested, what our obligations are to these Earth-based entities. This framework for ethical space is really drawn upon what we need to bring into from each of the spheres. Remember, Reg was talking about those two circles. What's in each of the systems? So we about the structural framework of what's in each of these systems, which is perpetuating conflict. We really wanted to explore things to their very, very root, peel the onion, if you will, all the way back to the beginning. So we actually went back to God on the Western side and Creator on the Indigenous side. And we asked ourselves, where does authority for the way we behave come from? Who makes the laws? Why are we having such challenges in understanding each other's legal frameworks and what stories mean on the non-Indigenous, on the Indigenous side? So we think, okay, well, what happens when God, the Creator, creates the world, right? Those are the similar. And one point here is that these structures of society are just two manifestations of the infinite possibility for how societies structure themselves within the vast infinity of the universe. So it's really quite interesting. And my point that I'd like to make as we go through here is to think, as we're exploring this, and if all things come from the metaphysical, how can one society, how can one structure be more valid or more credible than the other? This is a really important component because we come to this discussion with all of our assumptions about the validity and credibility of our existing system. What we work through here is an understanding that really what Indigenous people have been saying is that their system is equally valid. When we explore the origins of these systems, we can begin to understand that more. So when the authority from God, it's delegated to a human entity, right? It's through the Christian religion and other types of religion. It's really given to a human entity. In Canada, this is manifested, if you will, through sort of the Queen figurehead. And I always use the example of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which explicitly states as its first line that we believe in the supremacy of God. So you can really see this clear authoritative link through the Queen to the Creator. So then what happens after that is that humans create constitutions, they create legislation, they develop policy, and then they do management, right? And I put science down here and I'll explain why in a minute. On the Indigenous side, same thing, the Creator creates the world, it's all good, but what happens then? The authority for how humans are behaved is not given to the human entities. And I'm not speaking again for all Indigenous peoples. This is based on my experience, my work, who I am, that kind of stuff. This authority for how humans behave is given to the earth itself, or the earth entities, the animals, the plants, the water, this type of thing, right? So those beings get to decide the fate of humans. They are the ones who determine what happens, how things should be, how humans should behave. So in the case of the Okanagan, with whom I work with a lot, the Creator gave the authority to determine what to do with these humans to the bear, to the salmon, to the Saskatoon berry, and to the bitterroot. So they had a conference and they determined how humans will behave. That knowledge about that authority is provided to humans through story. Those stories contain protocols. Those protocols derive management principles, and then people go about through their living. And so when we're in ethical space and we're trying to figure out, well, why do we have such a conflict? This is really a good way to begin to explore some of that conflict, right? And so what we have down here, and I'll explain sort of science and TEK, this is really TEK up here, right? Traditional ecological knowledge. All of that body of work is contained within these stories derived from the earth itself. So what is science? Science is really a methodology for observing the earth, generating results, developing analysis, and providing recommendations for how humans should behave in order to do certain things or maintain consistency within the earth, its health and stuff like that. So same with these stories on the Indigenous side. They're simply earth-based observation mechanisms and analysis and recommendations making as well, right? The biggest difference here is that earth-based observation on the Indigenous side carries inherent authority. It carries legal weight. Earth-based observation on the Western side, or the science side, carries no inherent legal authority. So this is a big challenge because when well-intentioned scientific and management practitioners are wanting to do the right thing, they're wanting to reconcile, they're wanting to include, incorporate, or involve Indigenous knowledge within their management planning, within the scientific results, that's really good and well-intentioned because they think, oh, that's interesting and useful information. But it's not just information, it's the actual law. So when you're drawing from Indigenous knowledge into these policy documents, you're really subjugating this entire body, this entire societal legislative framework to a place in Western authority which has no authority. What happens when you do management planning, science-based management planning, is you enter this policy validation feedback loop, which is really about subjugating the, well, not subjugating, it's really about having that earth-based observation subject to the policy validation feedback loop, which, as we all know, is subject to things like budgetary constraints, consistency with other laws, political whims, all of those things which go into policy making. So then you're compromising, your risk of compromising all of that Indigenous law is really, really high in this policy document. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, and when we begin to understand that when we're talking about scientific management, ecological management, reconciling with Indigenous ecological knowledge, we need to understand the weight and authority that ecological knowledge, that Indigenous knowledge contains. So within this ethical space, we're drawing examples we're drawing information into the space about, the structures of society. And to put an example to this point is when I was negotiating this memorandum of understanding with others, including the federal government, the provincial government, and 2 Indigenous nations. And we wanted to make sure that we were developing within this ethical space what needed to be, we were generating parity within the legal systems within this memorandum of understanding space. So what we brought in from the non-Indigenous side was the National Parks Act as one example. So that contains particular guidance to people who are going about their daily lives around not picking endangered species, not polluting water, not littering, this kind of thing. So we search on the Indigenous side for the equivalent story which contains the same type of guidance. Treat the water with respect, don't litter, don't unnecessarily pick plants, all that kind of stuff, and come up with a similar story. Could be, for example, horse story. There's the MOU is available online if you wanted to take a look at that. But what are those particular stories, i.e. laws, that contain that same guidance? And then we generate the document to reflect both of those legislative frameworks. This begins to create equity within that. And part of the work that we're doing is to make sure that the non-Indigenous side understands the obligation it's adhering to when it signs an agreement like that. For example, an MOU is a non-legally binding agreement on the federal government side, but what we brought in from the Indigenous side is this process called speaking with one voice. Nextine, I can't spell it. And so what that equivalent process for agreement within the Okanagan context means is that it's a binding agreement. Speaking with one voice is a binding agreement. And so the federal government is binding itself to Indigenous law through that mechanism, through these oral traditions and stuff like that. So on this side, we could have those kinds of protocols include these processes for agreement, ceremonies, those kinds of things, right? And so as we're attempting to reconcile, really acknowledging and thinking through some of these differences, these challenges, these sort of hierarchical nature of what we're talking about in relation to the differences between TEK and science is really important to think through. Again, my point here is that this takes time, and as we acknowledge what we're able to change, how we're able to think through these problems at whatever level of work that we're doing, I think this is really required for reconciliation. By way of example, I'll reference this recent watershed management plan that I was working on. Within that large watershed planning document, which was meant to make recommendations to the provincial government, they had throughout really wanted to include a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, a lot of Indigenous information to make the plan better. This is a really worthy goal. The practitioners, the people wanted to do stuff that was good, to say, okay, let's try and make the best use of information. Let's take what we have that's really good from all of our bases of understanding and include it in the plan. What they said then is, we hope this plan will inform policy. The challenge with having traditional ecological information inform policy is that you're taking the highest level of authority, that highest level story, that highest level traditional ecological knowledge, and subjugating it to a policy validation feedback mechanism which has very limited authority within the Western context. So this is really a big challenge and a big sense of frustration for Indigenous people, because why would you do that? No matter how well-intentioned your management practitioners are to include the best information in the Indigenous knowledge, they're still subjugating that authority to this policy validation feedback loop. That's the essence of the big challenge we have when we're trying to integrate or incorporate or include Indigenous knowledge within Western scientific frameworks, management planning, and documentation. So when we're thinking about the need to resolve this deep conflict, how do we begin to think about that? We begin to think about where we are on these levels, where we can influence change, where we can demonstrate understanding, where we acknowledge these deep roots of conflict are structural and systemic and not going to be resolved by the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge within management documents. When we're thinking about ethical space, we're thinking about processes which are expansions of things like decolonization, which you've heard of, with things like indigenization. It's really begin to think about how we can support Indigenous management of the land. If we're going to live up to UNDRIP, the application of Indigenous law, and develop reconciled relationships, we need to be reconciling at all of these various layers of the law. And so when we think about decolonization, I actually don't really like that term because it creates in my mind a bit of a vacuum. If we're pulling away the colonial approach, what do we have left? We have this Indigenous approach, but ethical space acknowledges that we're both here. We both need to be working on this space together. So if we're going to be working towards the recognition of Indigenous law, how can we better support that? Because that application of Indigenous law is really the place where we're going to have reconciliation. I like the concept of indigenization because it means we're really going to try and collaborate and cooperate around how we're reconciling these various levels of law and various authoritative schemes. Ethical space is a framework for having these discourses about these various levels of law and how to reconcile these various legislative frameworks. There's a lot of opportunity to begin to have these types of dialogues which support the goal of healing Indigenous people's relationship to their land through the collective application of Indigenous law. One example in some of the work that I've been doing in negotiating a memorandum of understanding with the federal government around a national park reserve is to really explore what's coming into that space from these particular legislative frameworks. So for example, the National Park Act is a legislative component. It's a legislative law which comes into the space which the Western side has to adhere to. So what does that law say? It says things like, you don't litter, you're going to graze at certain periods of time, you don't pick endangered species, this kind of thing. So when we're thinking about how to build these equivalencies and develop reconciliation within this legal framework, within this ethical space-based legal framework that we're beginning to put together as our society moves towards reconciliation, is to understand what story provides the equivalent behavioral guidance on the Indigenous side. So in the case of this example, it could be horse story, which says basically don't pick species which are endangered or protect the water, these kinds of similar guidances. So we looked to both of the legislative frameworks for those particular guidances within law and with Indigenous story, which provide the same behavioral constraints or behavioral expectations on the societal participants. So as we're doing this work and we're contributing what's important to bring into the space from both of these places, it's important that this will take time. A lot of Indigenous nations are beginning a process of revitalizing, reinvigorating, retelling their Indigenous stories, their Indigenous laws, building their legislative frameworks and behavioral guidance based on Indigenous law, articulating and codifying it. So it's a process which will take time. And this whole ethical space really in this way imagines this resolution, this reconciliation between these legislative frameworks so that we're guided by both ways of knowing. And I think that's a really beautiful exercise to strive towards, but it will take time and we're all at different levels. We need to acknowledge where we are within the process where we can affect change. One of the key components that I talk about within this ethical-based space framework and bringing forward that knowledge is also bringing forward the acknowledgement of the limitations and constraints within the existing system. First Nations people have been saying for a long time, you come and you say good things. Like the management practitioners who, give us your TEK, we really want that, it'll help make things better. Those are good intentions and they're well-meaning. But what's really important is that we begin to understand that there's a whole lot more that we need to be exploring within this space. if we are truly going to live up to UNDRIP in Canada, in that we recognize Indigenous laws, we support and adhere to the commitments to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, this is the work that I feel we need to do. And again, it will take a long time, but it's a commitment that we need to demonstrate. Continuing the example of the National Park Reserve MOU, we really wanted to make sure that we got the Indigenous concepts, language, and instruction into the document. On the Western side, we're saying a Memorandum of Understanding is a non-legally binding document. On the Indigenous side, we're saying that speaking with one voice, or the closest equivalent to what an MOU intends, is a binding commitment to the parties to to commit to what they agreed to. So it's really important there that on the Indigenous side, we took our responsibility and accepted the onus that we made the non-Indigenous party understand the commitments and concepts they were abiding to. So this process was intensive in that we had all these workshops to make sure that the non-Indigenous participants understood what they were agreeing to. So we got in the document these concepts like Sketara or inherent rights, or Chaptik, this doctrine for transference of all knowledge, or Sme, the stories of tradition between animal people and the human domain. And we did this through a process called Nexkin, or speaking with one voice. It's to help each other and considering all the multi-general impacts. These types of concepts are similar yet different than a lot of westernized concepts, so it was really important to have them in their language and be understood. In this ethical space-based approach to negotiating an MOU or speaking with one voice commitment, we really needed to establish these Indigenous concepts and terms within the language, within the document, and make sure that the governments understood what they were agreeing to. This type of work creates this opportunity and creativity, if you will, in the legal sphere. If we're beginning to understand that we're going to have to reconcile across these legislative and legal structural components and the laws themselves, we need to bring forward that understanding. One of the commitments that Reg talked about in relation to ethical space-based dialogue is the commitment of the parties to bring forth what's required into that space. The onus is on Indigenous people to bring forward that information. So it's a lot of responsibility, but in order to achieve this reconciliation, it's what's required. One other note I would make is that a lot of work has been done from Indigenous people in bringing forward their intentions, their laws, their knowledge, their desires. So when we're in this space and beginning to think about what's required, there are historical informations that we can draw upon. One example is this Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial from 1910. It's an Indigenous policy statement which is 112 years old, and it says, "These people wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. We will share equally in everything, half and half, in land, water, and timber, etc. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. We will help each other to be good and great." This is an Indigenous policy statement between the Inkaplakamuks, the Shuswap, and the Okanagans. So this, I don't think I've ever read a less ambiguous policy statement. It's very, very clear what the policy statement is. And so if we're going to live up to the obligations of UNDRIP to recognize these things, it's fairly straightforward. And so we've included this in the Memorandum of Understanding. And this is the type of work that we need to do to begin to understand each other better and to really build documents and agreements and relationships which reflect dualistic policy-based statements based on Indigenous and Western law. So I hope that after this presentation, you'll think through your understandings of this framework, this process of dialogue within your own work, and begin to really acknowledge where you're at and how you can incorporate this within your future work.